Leader for the water industry, and really what we want to get going here on is really looking at putting together a group where we can actually collaborate and share ideas. So, what is the Water Automation Think Tank? Basically, what we're going to have is a quarterly meeting like this. We'll adapt as we go, but the idea would be to have just a kind of a group think and sharing of ideas and problems that we're running into, and how our customers are actually solving some of these challenges as well. So that'll be some of the key topics we'll cover every meeting. Like what's a key challenge? How do we solve it? And really, hopefully, the goal here is also so that we can learn from each other. So you might see something interesting like from our presentation today, and think through if a solution like that might make sense for you, or a variation of it. We also want to talk about some trends in the industry as we kind of move forward, and just kind of talk through how these things could start evolving and impact the future as well. And from our perspective, what we want to do is learn from you guys as well on what is most important for you, so we can actually adapt our products and solutions around that. And also, as we go through this, if you say it'd be great to hear this topic or that topic, definitely reach out to us as well on that. Because we want to have this forum improve and be more powerful as we move forward as well. So for today's session, I'm talking here about the introduction to the forum. We do have John Franklin from the city of Mesa, who's going to talk about how he applied a cloud historian in a hybrid format to solve some problems and challenges they were having. We'll also have some open discussion on that, allow you guys to ask questions, as well as comment on ideas or different ways of doing things as well. We are going to give a bit of a product update. We do have a new version of Operations Hub, so I have Amy Wooten that'll talk about some of the new things available there. And then one of the challenges and initiatives we see a lot in the water industry is really around user experience. Some of you may have heard of it as high performance graphics and that type of thing. Really, so what we want to do there is just talk about some of the approaches for that as well, and again, get your feedback. And we also have our technical team on that you're going to be allowed to ask some technical questions and things like that, and have some discussion around some technical topics. And then and I kind of have this, it's really an open discussion, voice a customer, things that you guys are looking for, things that you need help with, that problems you need to solve in the future. That we're always open to hearing from you on those type of topics anyway, but we will leave some time to, let you guys weigh in on some of that. Just some housekeeping in terms of, the approach around this meeting. I mean, just to be respectful and hopefully stay muted if you can. Please do stay muted during the presentations and discussions. And if you do want to comment or ask a question, go ahead and raise your hand. And you'll see the little, in the Teams meeting, that you should see the raise the hand icon for that. And then we'll address you, and you can go ahead and speak your mind or ask a question. You can also enter if you do have questions, there is a Q&A button as well in the meeting that you can click on, and that'll allow you to ask. If you don't want to come off mute type of thing, you can still ask it there, and we'll get to those questions. If we do get so many that we can't get to them all today, we will capture those and try to get back to you by email or follow up as well. And just another note, we are recording this event, as not everyone can always join. We know that'll be the case, every meeting. So we just want to make that available for others as well to listen into after the event as well. So with that, I'm going to hand over control to John, who's the Utility Control System Supervisor at City of Mesa. Hopefully I got that right, John. He's going to go through, some of the challenges he faced and how he solved it as our first presenter. So John, I'll let you take the share away and jump into your presentation and discussion.
Okay, thank you, Jimmy. And greetings, everybody. Hopefully my screen share is working and you all can see it.
We can.
Okay, well, again, John Franklin here with the City of Mesa. We're about, I think just south of about 600,000 in population with 6 facilities mixed between water, wastewater, and energy. And so when they asked me to talk about this, I think I'll just go ahead and open it up. But running into the issue that I think a lot of people may have is we've been historizing data for seems like forever, and it's just data that can't get out. Siloed data is what we've called it, but how to get it out there for people to get the data. And we get more and more requests as time goes on, and the valley here is growing so fast that you're trying to get more integrators in there or engineering firms in there to help you to model your water system, your wastewater system, to keep things rolling. And they're constantly asking for more data. So there was, issues like that, issues between even our environmental, requirements to even operations and internal engineering that are outside of the SCADA system, but, they all still want that data. And so that's kind of where we started out. And it just kind of helps all the way around. And so one of the things I started playing with was, and it literally was just kind of playing around, testing it. And we used the MQTT, and I had some coworkers in the IT department that were the DBAs that were really working with Azure and with Databricks. And so when we got together, I thought, well, let's see if we can actually, kick this off, because I really don't know of anybody that was doing it. And it's kind of, this is a typical architecture, I think, but in our case, we don't have fix in this. I think there's another slide here. Yeah, this is probably more the basic layout of our system in a very generalized form. But that's it. That's how simple it really looks. I wish it were that simple to execute, but it got there. And our challenges really were working with our security team, making sure that we closed any holes, that we were meeting all of their requirements. And in a biggie is having the IT department that's willing to work with you and work side by side and actually have buy-in. Because there is a lot of work. I'm going to admit right off the bat, I know very little about Azure and Databricks. What I've learned is just by doing this project, and that team on that side helped me immensely as far as getting the JSON string, all of that stuff together properly, getting the security and certificates and everything together to work well. And so that's one challenge, is that you're going to have to work really well with your IT team. And I know the old OT-IT battlegrounds are kind of a thing in the past. There's still some definite lines between the two, but it's merging more and more. It was also just from the security side, making sure that the right people could see the data, and only the right people. Which you have that same security, not just within the historian, but you also have that within Azure as well. And again, that the outcomes and benefits are kind of, for us anyway, is it did give a centralized location for the data, so that now we could have outside entities basically get permission to read that data to do their own number crunching, or we could even do our KPIs for whether you're using Power BI, Grafana, whatever outside tool you want to use, and now that data is available. And that made it pretty nice for the people over in our engineering staff. And also city manager, our department heads, they love charts. So this is a neat way to get that chart data out there to them. Just to give you a quick example here, this is the dashboard for in Databricks itself. And just to kind of give you an idea of the throughput that we got through it, and I thought this was kind of interesting, is as you can look, as we're, you got over 300,000 values, and in your timestamp, within that just 1 day's time. We're doing right now about 1,000 tags as it is, because we're still, kicking this off the ground. But the throughput was pretty nice. I was fairly impressed. You can look at our latency over the data retrieval, and in 15 seconds, that's not too bad. I was pretty pleased. We are doing fairly slow data, but as far as it's bringing it over, you can see that the 300K in the 15-second time range and working in Databricks is pretty simple. You've got AI in your back pocket, so as soon as I do a query, AI will pop up and tell me what to do to fix it. Wished I had that about 10 years ago. And but I just kind of wanted to show just different ways that the IT department came in, and they said, okay, well, let's see if this is going to be really a value add. And when they saw the performance of it, they thought, yeah, this is something that can really work. And we've had it up for about, I would say a little over 6 months. And we've been pretty pleased with it. And we are running Historian 2024, and then the Azure IoT collector, which is kind of like server-to-server collector. I don't know, whatever name you want to call it, but that's the collector we're running. Some of the other challenges that you'll have is your tag count. The way I'm doing it, and I was seeking some feedback from GE on this as well, was that you're basically going to need a tag for every point that goes into the cloud. So when your tag count's going to go up, it's just speaking as a customer. It is. Yeah, I warned you, Jimmy. It is a little difficult when you figure you buy the tag at the SCADA node, and then you buy the tag at the Historian, and now I had to buy the tag a third time. So that's something to keep in mind. Of course, each time you buy that tag, all in their defense, it's for a different business need, but it's still the same value being purchased 3 times. But other than that, the performance of it and everything we like. All the other bean counters are out there, and all the other developers can do their own thing, and I don't have to deal with it. And it was very self-serving on my department's end. We wanted to get away from that. We're not statisticians, we're not data analysts, we are SCADA guys. And so they quit coming to us. They can just stay on their side of the fence and take care of themselves, and if the IT needs us, they call us. And so that's really the gist of what I had to discuss, what we did. If anybody has any questions on details.
Yeah, John, actually, one of the things I was going to ask is I know you and I discussed before just around kind of that architecture. I don't know if you can go back to it, but like you mentioned, you had, I believe you had Historian both at, there. So you had Historian kind of at the IT layer as well as the DMZ and in the cloud, like you mentioned. I mean, are there some advantages to the architecture? Like, obviously, Historians on site, but also
Correct.
in the cloud. But I assume there's some advantages to having that architecture as well. Right?
The reason we chose this type of architecture is every plant, every facility wanted it to be able to stand on its own, and so they can each facility is firewalled and DMZ'd on its own, And so if we lose connectivity between facilities, it's just an inconvenience. It's not an outage. And so the historians that are on site are production historians, for lack of another term. They're there for the operator process. Then we are doing server-to-server collectors to the centralized historian in the DMZ. So and we do that for people to be able to get their fingers in and hit it. Well, that was working okay, but when you get on the other side of the DMZ into the enterprise, that you have a lot of end users that are having to hit that historian, which poses more security risks, and it's it's just more exposure. And so, that was the other reason, is how do we reduce that exposure? And so by moving that data up here into the cloud, now we don't need to poke any more holes into the DMZ than we have to. And so that was kind of the idea behind it. Before, we had people that's, really the only thing that you get for historian for data retrieval is the Excel add-in. And so I would end up with a dozen engineers trying to use the Excel add-in to dig into the DMZ to pull data. And, it's good for what it is, but the Excel add-in is just that. It's what it is. Not a lot to it. And it has its own hiccups. So we needed something that was a little more robust, a method to actually get to that data. So that was the reason, the architecture we chose. Now, there's probably better architectures out there, but this is the path that we had picked several years back when we were just trying to protect our system. And as cybersecurity becomes more and more, what do you want to say? It's an ever evolving process. So did that kind of answer it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think another question is, you mentioned about working with IT. Were there any specific approach you took to that? Obviously they're in the industry of keeping people out, and obviously you're trying to make the data available. But did you take that? What approach did you take with that?
Well, that's really kind of funny, because you think I've been in this business for 30 years, and for the first 15 of it, I was trying to get data out to people, and the last 15 of it's been trying to keep people out of the data. And it's really hilarious how time just goes full circle. Mainly, don't be adversarial with your IT department. Work with them.
Right.
Most of the time, you find, at least in the bigger cities, I think would probably be more common. They're busy, so they don't really want your SCADA system. And that's what we have here anyway. They're real busy. So if you can be self-sustaining, they're all happy, and they'll do anything to keep you that way. And in the same token, you have a big knowledge base there, and so you kind of chum them with. They're getting hit with other needs, so their choice to get this data was to use linked servers between the historian and SQL. And that has its own challenges. And so when the DBAs had a choice of doing the link server method or being able to get it into Azure, they were like, okay, we've been doing the link server for 10 years. What else do we have? Because technology's taking us another route. And so their buy-in was kind of automatic on that end of it, once they saw that there was options to just doing it that way. And I'd kind of forgotten about that, but that was our database group's motivator. And then it was just a matter of getting the security team and everything to see, what ports had to be opened and how many ports could be closed, and, what outside exposure are we reducing, things like that. Right. And I've got a question here that's the process of choosing the right historian.
Yeah.
Well, what was important for us is not losing data, having a historian that could always feed forward type thing. When with the collectors, we started out with Proficy Historian when it was in its infancy, and it had a lot of growing pains, but back in its infancy it did, but it matured to be quite the product to me. when we first looked at it, it had a lot to do with price points too. It's the best competitor it had out there, or its competitor was extremely expensive in the price points. And before I got into water and wastewater, I was in energy, and we did power generation. And so the big king of historians in that market was just extremely expensive. And again, they didn't provide any tools really per se, other than the equivalent of Proficy Historian, and that's a kind of an Excel add-in. But what was important is to be able to, if the historian's down, am I losing data, or is it still storing data so that when I get the historian up, it'll keep it? That was a biggie for us. When you upgrade a historian, how much heartburn is it to migrate, or to do an upgrade, or to move to a new box? There is a lot of virtualization out there. At Mesa, our SCADA group, we kind of minimize our virtualization. But data storage, how does it do it? What's the, what's going to be the challenges in migration? So those are a couple of the biggies that helped us choose.
Yeah, I guess like you mentioned the part with the historian on for the SCADA, and then the one in the cloud, so to speak. I think that's sort of like the store and forward, I think, is what you were using there, right? So that if you lost connection, it'd still collect, and kind of a form of redundancy.
Correct. But and then just the collectors themselves, the collectors will store. And so even if the historian at the plant is down, the collector's still doing its job. Right. And so when it comes back online, it'll have to backfill. I was going to give, I know we have some of the development team on here, so I was going to ding them with this little screenshot here. When you get your Azure cloud up, and now you've got your connection, your Databricks, and now you need to backfill it. You got to get some data in there. It's going to start as of today, but these guys want data from last year. So I had to do some deep diving into the knowledge base to find this little tidbit. And basically, you may have to create a second server-to-server collector so that you don't get a conflict with your Azure to IoT cloud collector that's doing the real-time data. And you'll have to run this, and it's just going to look at the tag list as a text file. And you have to pick the dates, and it's basically, what is that, epoch time? So you have to convert your time range of when you want to pull the data from to epoch time, and put it in there, and then run this command line. And it just would seem to me that if we're building a collector to do this, and it's going to be a known that you're going to have to backfill it with data, that this would have been a really neat little GUI. Hint, hint.
Okay, I think I'll call that a VOC.
Because without it, the only data you're going to have is what you start collecting from that very moment. And so, and it works. It just runs, and you just let that command line box stay open until it's done. And it can take, for me, it ran for a day, and it backfilled the data that I needed. But if we add new tags into Azure, you're going to have to run this again. So that was just my little ding.
Okay.
Hey, John, I think we just had a hand raise. If we can get to him real quick. It just went down. Sir, if you just had your hand up, if you could come off mute real quick, we'd love to hear your question.
It was me. My name is Stamatios Sobariotis. I'm from the city of Laval up in Canada. Actually, I think you did answer my question, but your Proficy historians on the data acquisition on the lower part of your screen, is that an essential, or is it a complete?
I think actually, Jimmy, I think you and I even discussed this, that you could probably, if you felt that you could probably do the collection directly from the DMZ. But we've got it pretty tight and pretty closed, and we wanted the historian that's at the bottom of the screen to be purely for operations. And
Yeah,
so
that's what we have as well. So we have an essential there and a full license up top in the DMZ.
Yeah, I think, John, I think what he's asking, there's a
license
historian essentials is sort of
essentials,
that,
yes.
the light version that we include with SCADA,
Exactly.
versus
And
a standard historian, which I'm not sure which one you've got there, but.
so we've got standard historians on the site. So in each site, I mean, they're not massive amounts. So I think probably 10,000 tags each, in that range of, and so a lot of that data stays there that goes to the historian there and doesn't go up into the DMZ just because it's
we
data
use it as mainly to populate our SCADA. So that's why we're using the actual intent of it, which is the essential, to have a couple of tags there to build our graphs on the SCADA. And any important tag is brought up to the DMZ.
Right.
I had a secondary question, which is, how did you find the server-to-server reliability? Because we've experienced issues with the S2S that it wasn't on 100%, and we needed it 100%, which is basically that was our main issue. We had a lot of issues making it work. I think it's still problematic to this day.
That's interesting because we haven't really had any issues with the S2S. Each one of these, the only 2024 server in this group is the one in the DMZ. All the rest of these are, I think, I know I have a 7.1 and a couple of 8s. And a 2023. So, as we try to upgrade and cycle replace hardware, we kind of hold off, but they've all been backwards compatible. We haven't had any issues. So it's interesting that, that you are, but, and we've had this model.
What we had as an issue was we wanted we wanted to separate our that's it. You wanted to use the server to server to have an acquisition server and a reporting server. And for a massive report to be requested, not to affect our acquisition server in DMZ, and the server to server function never came through. So but maybe that was not under version 2024. Maybe it was I have to verify, validate, but I think it was a 23.
Yeah, that's too bad. Yeah, well, that's something that we haven't experienced.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, what you might want to do on that is, maybe if you've got a specific issue, maybe create a case if you haven't done that already, and see if our support team can help you troubleshoot that.
Yeah, that's been done. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? One thing I did want to ask you while I asked to see if there's other questions from the audience. John, one of the things you'd mentioned is also you had part of the reason for getting into the cloud was also to enable external access. You've got some contractors you're working with, and I'm just curious if there was any specific security challenges there, or if it worked out okay overall.
Yeah, I should say there always is. When when COVID hit, that really changed everything. But we also learned a lot. We were doing startups on a 30 MGD wastewater plant, and right in the middle of COVID, it hit, and we were trying to do startup. Well, that just really threw a wrench in our integrator, our design engineering firm. And so we already started learning how do we give remote access? What kind of remote access can we get? And so after those learning exercises, it actually was really helpful for us as we move forward. But what we had learned is that through our security process, if it's an outside engineering firm that needs to get data, security screening and follow the security team's steps and processes to get that, which would then allow them to come into Databricks, or they would get their authentication to where they could log into Databricks from their location and actually data mine out of our cloud instance. And another one was where we have multiple cities where we do joint ventures. So you may have two cities that share, resources or share plants, or they both discharge into the same facility. And so they need to look at performance data from both sides. Yeah, we live in the desert, so water is gold. That said is liquid gold. So everybody wants their water credits. Everybody wants their water, they want their fair share. And so one way of doing it was, and one instance is we used Grafana as the hook. And so they did their data dashboard with Grafana. Another one did Power BI or reporting solutions. I don't know, there's so many of them out there. But it was another way where they could actually get into Azure, hook that, and then they had their own dashboard at their city that they could maintain. So it broke that umbilical cord, for lack of another term, of having to come back to us to get the data. Did that answer your question? I think those are two methods that we used.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, and I guess one last one I had, John, was obviously running things in the cloud is different than probably maintaining things on-prem. Were there any kind of benefits around, I don't know if it's from an IT management or you managing systems or operating systems? Is there anything that you gained from running it in the cloud versus having yet another historian kind of on-prem, as an example? Yeah.
Well, it took the maintenance away from us, which is, being selfish. That's what I wanted. And I'm not, like I say, I may be speaking out of turn here with Azure and how it works, but I think even when you're paying for it, there's a cost savings by doing cloud-based, because I notice that when I go in and I do queries in the cloud, it has to, for lack of another term, start up the engine, or basically your meter's running. And then when you're not using it, the meter's not running. So, and basically there's a cost savings there that, depending on how heavily it's used is how expensive it is. And again, that's probably more than, I don't understand half of what I do know about it, but the IT department seemed to be very, very excited about that part of it. It's just a cost savings for them, and just hardware management. So, it takes a whole bunch of VMs and a whole bunch of SQL servers that I'm sure they have way more than I can imagine now out, and gives them other options. So the benefits really there was on their end of their just ease of access for them and maintenance costs on their end. So, and I think that was made the big motivator on their side, I think. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for your time, John. And I guess for the next section, Amy, hopefully we'll give you the reins and you can take over. And yeah, we see your screen.
Yep.
You're not in presentation mode, but
sorry, I'm getting there.
That's all right.
Sorry,
you're getting there. No problem.
It's trying. Hey, folks! In case you haven't had the chance to chat with me before. I'm Amy Wooten, and I'm the product manager for Operations Hub. I'm joined today also with Rohan, who's one of the TPMs for Operations Hub. So we're going to give you a little bit of an update for Ops Hub, Operations Hub. We just had our 2025 release, and we're also going to show you some exciting work that Rohan has done with select customers and looking how they can sort of reimagine their screens inside Operations Hub. All right, so just mentioning here, the safe harbor disclaimer. Okay, so again, if you're sort of new to Operations Hub, the big idea is that we have a great number of customers at GE Vernova And often they have multiple products that they have to interact with on a day-to-day basis, right? Obviously, here we're talking about SCADAs, iFIX and Simplicity. We've also talked about Historian. Sometimes they have, plant apps as well, Proficy plant applications, batch, right? But they also have third-party sources, right? Sometimes they are using, third-party historians, or they have to integrate with other systems. And often they're looking for a way to quickly and easily build screens for plant operations without having to sort of know where each piece of data is coming from. They just want to have it displayed on the screen, custom built for whatever user is interacting with it. And that can be someone who's a plant manager who's very interested in, their site production, all the way to maybe an operator on the plant floor who's monitoring abnormal conditions. So that's really where Operations Hub comes into play, right? You can see our tagline here. We are a centralized environment to rapidly build industrial applications. So we basically want to be that single interface, that single pane of glass that you go to create these different UIs, these different applications for your users. And to do that, right, we have a couple of different building blocks, if you will. We have mechanisms for connecting to data, whether that's OPC-UA, MQTT, SQL, REST, or GraphQL. We have a wide variety of visualizations that come out of the box, or you can create your own. And we have a screen building area where you're basically dragging and dropping your widgets and binding them to data and often layering in interactions. So that's sort of the gist of Operations Hub. And today I'm just going to be walking you through some of the recent developments in 2025. Okay, I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but I did just want to mention that we are a relatively younger product, right? I think our first release was actually in 2019. Since that initial release, we have been adding every year to our data connectivity capabilities, right? You can sort of see, as we pile on here. We've also been building in additional visualizations. There are different kinds of widgets that you will see in Operations Hub, some for display, some for user inputs. And another big thing that we've been working on is user experience. This is something that we've received a lot of feedback on. And so every release, we're trying to do some work to improve how users interact with Operations Hub and how they build screens. So you're going to see a continuation of that in Operations Hub 2025, because that's sort of some of the main themes that we have. All right. So for 2025, we had a couple of features. Probably the biggest feature we had was scripting, and this is really around making Operations Hub more extensible. So this provided a way for users to inject custom logic, especially when they're building screens and they need to do some processing of the data before or after it's displayed, if they need to do some calculations or formatting or whatnot. In the HMI space, again, we took a hard look at how do users interact with data when they're in Operations Hub. And one of the things that we've tried to do is to make that experience a little closer to what you could expect in iFIX from Simplicity. So instead of having to deal with something called queries in the background, which is sort of under the covers how Operations Hub gets data, we try to make the experience more tag and asset data forward. So you're coming in to your widget and you're selecting tags for that widget, or you're selecting asset properties for that widget. In the MES space, we introduced another data connector. This is called a GraphQL connector. It doesn't have to be used for MES. It's just that the plant applications team specifically helped us building this out because they are introducing a new plant applications GraphQL API, but it is a generic connector that can be used for any GraphQL source. So again, trying to open up the different sources that Operations Hub can reach into so that you can build these really rich displays that sort of bring all your data together in one place. And then finally, there's a couple of other areas that we've worked on. I'll mention trending, another area that we work on pretty much every release. We're always enhancing our trending. It's one of our oldest widgets. And also, we've done a number of enhancements around helping folks find what they need to within Operations Hub, being able to copy between pages in case you want to reuse artifacts, and also modernizing our tech stack. Okay, so I'll just go into these, pretty quickly. For the simplified data binding, again, we've sort of received feedback around, hey, the query system is great as far as it gives you the ability to specify exactly what you want and the source that you're going to and all the arguments, that you might need. But especially for customers that are only interested really in iFIX simplicity historian data, it's really a bit overkill to have to craft a query every time you want to get data from our own GE Vernova sources, right? So we have now sort of relooked at this experience. So when you come into Operations Hub, this is the page builder UI, by the way. If you have, say, a chart selected, you can come in here and browse. For that chart, you can click on the different tags. Click on the different tags that you want to see, and then you have some data retrieval settings, including start time and time duration, all that good stuff. So really sort of trying to give you that experience that you have come to expect if you work a lot with iFIX and simplicity. For scripting, I'll mention we now have support for client-side scripting. We are supporting Python as the language. And the idea here is that you can create a library of scripts. You can kind of see here, there's a list of scripts that have already been created. You can define the inputs to the script. You can define the outputs of the script. And then, of course, you can create the logic that will transform the inputs into the outputs. So in the past, we were sort of constrained by what underlying APIs would let us access, right? So if you had a REST API and it allowed for sorting, then great, we can return data in a sorted order. But if the REST API didn't allow for sorting, then too bad, so sad, you would return your data set without sorting. Putting in this scripting means that you can now do things like select portions of your data set, go through each item and do some calculations on them, searching, sorting, and filtering, like I mentioned, intensive calculations, and also even just displaying them for pretty print as well. So this really just gives you an ability to inject your custom logic before using the data inside an Operations Hub screen. All right, moving on, GraphQL connector. As I mentioned, this is another way to get data into Operations Hub. So we have OPC UA, REST, SQL, MQTT, and now the GraphQL connector. The big idea here is that GraphQL has a property that is called mutability, and it lets you sort of determine how you want the response to look. All right, so you can pick sort of the pieces of data that you're interested in versus not interested in, and it's also quite type-based. So instead of having to remember all the individual APIs for interacting with your data and remember what the inputs are, you're able to instead to browse that GraphQL source and to pick sort of the pieces of data that you're interested in, and it gives you sort of a tailored data display based on that. So again, our main driver for this one was to support plant applications. Obviously, Operations Hub is very concerned with ensuring that we are the best at connecting to our own GE Vernova sources. And so we want to ensure that we supported plant applications, but it is a generic connector. So if you have other sources, other GraphQL sources of data, you can go ahead and use it for those sources as well. All right, and last here, I'll just mention that the team has done quite a bit of work on improving our performance. For this pass specifically, they were more focused on HMI type use cases. So we looked at some of the most commonly used widgets when building an HMI. This includes the graphics, right? You have these sort of SVG graphics that you can animate with color, with data, and also value displays. So very common to use in great quantities when you're building HMI screens. So you can, I won't go through the results individually, but I'll mention that there have been sort of massive reductions in some of those page load times and some of those update rate times, right? You can see some of the areas before where we were overloaded, right? We've now brought that retrieval down to a more manageable timing. So I think that I just want to leave you with the impression that, being able to support making process graphics and HMI type screens is definitely one of our use cases and something that we'll continue to invest in as a product going forward. Okay, and finally, before I turn it over to Rohan, I'll just say there are many ways to get started with Operations Hub. Probably the easiest way, if you are a historian, a GE historian, GE Vernova historian customer, then use Operations Hub trending, right? It already comes with historian, and you can go ahead and pull up the screen and do all sorts of historical analysis looking at that data from historian. You can use the same trend tool to look at live data coming in from iFIX and Simplicity as well. Another way you can get started with Operations Hub, if you have web space, you can go ahead and sort of pull your iFIX and Simplicity screens into Operations Hub and have them hosted in Operations Hub apps. So sometimes folks want to have, say, an iPad app, and they want to have, one of the HMI screens sort of embedded in that app. You can do that with Operations Hub in conjunction with the web space widget. If you are making new screens, particularly new screens on top of your HMIs. So we see this in the case of like centralized visualization, right? Or we've seen people have like a centralized command center. You can create different overview type screens that will sort of tie together your existing HMIs and give you a way to sort of have an overview of how things are going before they drill into the details of the particular SCADA screen. I'll mention here, with these new screens, you can build them with Operations Hub widgets on top of iFIX, Simplicity and Data, Simplicity and Historian data. You can, of course, use that web space widget, but you can also augment those screens with other data coming from SQL or coming from REST. So you really can sort of make those screens that have data come from a number of different sources and displayed just in a single view. And then finally, I think this is probably what most folks think about when they hear getting started with Operations Hub. So if you already have your HMI screens, you look for opportunities if you are planning to redesign them. So for example, you're going to talk to Joe in a bit, and he's going to tell you a bit about some considerations for designs when building HMI screens. If you are looking to redesign your existing screens, consider using Operations Hub, right? It gives you a natural point where you might want to consider using a different technology. So hopefully these are some options you can think about. You don't have to make a full immediate switch from, having all thick clients and then suddenly moving over to Operations Hub. You can sort of find these little opportunities to start exploring newer HTML5 technology for your visualization needs and get started. Yep. All right. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rohan, again, who's going to share some of the work that he's been involved with customers and looking at their HMI screens. Rohan?
Thanks. Yeah, Amy, Rohan, while you're transitioning, so I just wanted to prompt everyone, if you do have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A section as well. And we'll also open it up once Rohan goes through. And one thing I wanted you to also maybe, on that last slide you had, Amy, I mean, I think a big thing is that I think those enable a couple things, right? One is you can create system overviews and still leverage your existing screens. And then the other thing is, I've seen customers do that actually with like a map or something where they can click on it, it'll bring up the site screen and stuff like that. And then I think the other kind of key thing is it can run in parallel as well, right? Meaning as you want to transition from, traditional thick clients to maybe some people using the thin client, those can actually run in parallel as well, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, you don't have to make a clean switch from one to the other. You can start to dip your toes in one and still have your fully functional thick client screens working as you expect. Yep.
Right. Okay. Well, take it away, Rohan.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Rohan Sheth. So like Amy said, I'm one of the technical product managers for OpsHub. So for those of you who haven't played with OpsHub yet, I just wanted to give a brief intro to the graphics editor. So this was released in version 2023. And since then, we've been kind of making improvements with every release. So this tool is pretty powerful. You can create your own custom HMI graphics. You can also import really any SVG file into the system and begin to add animations on top of that. So the video that you're seeing here in loop is me getting a picture off of Wikipedia, importing it into the SVG graphics editor, which you can see here. Excuse me. And then once you import, you can see a list of all the different SVG elements, and you can start adding your animations. Okay. So here, I've built my own simple gauge and just wanted to show how easy it is to add animations. So we have several out-of-the-box animations. It's as easy as just right-clicking on the SVG element you want to animate and click Add, right? And so in the next couple slides, I'm going to show a couple of examples of real customers that I've worked with. I've done some workshops to see how we can transition some of their screens into OpsHub, what challenges I faced, and things like that. Okay. So this first POC that I did, this is their original iFIX screen. This is an air separation unit, I believe. So they created, standard dynamos for their indicators, their PID controllers, pumps, valves. They also had some controls here for showing and hiding tag names, also switching between real-time and historical data. And they also had this custom right-click menu. So when you right-click on a dynamo, it gives you the option to view the last 10 values, some details, and also, open it in a trend. So I took this screen. So any iFIX screen you could save as an SVG. Many people don't know that it's available, and you can import that into OpsHub. Okay, so the next slide is going to show what that looks like. So you'll notice that some of the things are missing with the import. Those are things we could definitely enhance in the future, but for the most part, it did import probably 80 to 90% of the shapes that were in your original screen. And there were some manual corrections I had to do to fix, like you might notice here, like some of the text is distorted. This is like a really quick, simple code or script you can run to fix that. So, removing the spacing and then also resizing some things that didn't get positioned quite right. But overall, it's very quick. Maybe took me 10 to 20 minutes to fix, to get it into this state. And then the next thing that I did is you can copy these dynamos into a separate graphics. That way it's easier to maintain. So I'll show you a couple examples of like, for example, here's like their indicator that they use. So I've added a click zone animation, text animations for the tag name, the value, and the engineering units here. And then did similar things for a valve, also click zone. We have a fill animation. Oop, I think I accidentally flipped. Fill animation to let you know how far open the valve is. Okay. And then also, this is their PID controller, similar thing, click zones, text animations. You can also see this one has like a mode indicator for the PID controller. Okay. So this next slide is the final POC that I did in OpsHub. So here I just did one simple valve. You can see you can hide and show tags. Also, you can click to open a faceplate. So here I have like kind of different tabs. So one is a trend, one is the last values, and I could change how many values I want to see. And then the next one is, tag details like alarm settings and things like that. So one thing I do want to note, there's no custom code. All of this was built with just out-of-the-box functionality, the SVG graphic editor, the out-of-the-box widgets like in the table and this trend. Like these are all widgets that come with OpsHub already pre-configured. So there's no custom coding or things you have to import from different systems to get that in. Okay. And then the other things that we're working on in the future is to enable simpler pop-ups and indirect tag binding, which is a runtime dynamic substitution. That'll really help build this screen at scale. Those are both features we're working on in the current release. Okay. I'll show one more example. I know we're kind of probably behind schedule. This is another customer. I believe this is also in wastewater. You can see this is their screen in iFIX, and you could tell that this is not really following, the new high performance HMI standards. So I took their screen, did the same process, and showed what that would look like in OpsHub, right? And so they also have alarm card. They weren't using trending, right? They had I believe they had a separate tool for that. So it kind of showed them what that would look like in OpsHub. Here, so here you can see I've standardized. I've kind of kept the same structure of the page. I standardized all the colors so where it's grayscale. I reduced the amount of clutter on their page by showing faceplates, also doing some tricks with the graphics to indicate statuses as opposed to spelling it all out if the valve's opened or closed. We also have a trend card here, and then this is our alarm card out of the box widget. You just add it to the page and it hooks up to your iFIX and Simplicity system, so you can get your alarms and acknowledge just like you would in iFIX. So that's all I had for the moment. If you guys are interested in doing a similar workshop or seeing how OpsHub can meet your needs, definitely reach out. I'll pass my information along to Jimmy and he could send that out. I guess Jimmy.
So so the next topic, as I mentioned, it kind of is a bit related. One of the big things we do see from a lot of our customers is that push to try to update their graphics and things like that for high performance and those type of things. So we have Joe Kenny, who's our director of user experience for our business and has worked with a lot of our customers just to provide some guidance, and he's going to go through how to create a consistent user experience across your system. So Joe, go ahead.
Alrighty, thanks Jimmy. So folks, I'll just introduce myself again, but Joe is fine. Some people call me Joseph, but Joe is great. I've been doing this at GE for approximately 10 years now. And essentially the thing that I really want to talk about is a lot of times when folks talk about creating a consistent user experience or high performance HMI, they honestly think of the graphical part, which is obviously the most impactful. We get 90% of our information through sight. But the reality is that it really is, in order to do true high performance HMI, it really starts with the process. And so one of the things I like to remind us all of when we're doing this is that the H in HMI stands for human. A lot of times we all do this. We default to creating machine interfaces, but we don't create human machine interfaces. And what I mean by that is we tend to technically put what we need on the screen and say, when I click this button, the activity happens that I expect to happen. But is it obvious to the user that you're targeting, the persona, the person that's supposed to do this day in, day out? Is it obvious that they're supposed to hit that button? Is the time sensitivity of their interaction really explicit in how you're doing the screen design? So you have to remember at the very start of this, for instance, if you come to a juncture where you go, really, we need to update our screens. So it's not just simply a transfer to another technology, which isn't simple in reality. But on top of that, you're saying, look, we actually are going to change our business process for how we're going to work and allow ourselves to be more efficient on the plant floor. That's really what high performance HMI is about. It's not about just switching over the graphics. It is about business process change. So you have to consider certain things. You have to consider, what are the goals for the success criteria? Not simply how do we update the screen, but why are we updating it? And what, most importantly, not only what are we showing, but what are we going to elect not to show anymore? What's the work environment like? Are we talking about people that are service individuals that are going out to wastewater facilities, for instance, and they're in a truck and their laptop is bolted to their dashboard? Are they on a tablet device, or are they in a control room facility? And what are the conditions in the control room facility? Is it a dark environment? Is it a bright environment outside in the sun? Those kinds of things. What's going on in the rest of the day of that person? So what are their challenges and distractions? Are they going to be able to focus and complete a complete multi-step task, or are they interrupted commonly? And does the software, for instance, allow for that hold time? And doesn't time out on the user, for instance, those kinds of things. So one of the things I like to talk about, and I won't belabor this slide, but one of the things that folks have to do when they're designing the HMI is they look at the different personas they have. And these are very common high-level personas. But for instance, when you're designing an HMI screen, one of the common mistakes is you say, well, we'll design the screens for all the personas, so the screen will work for everybody. That is not high-performance HMI. High performance HMI is when you say, I am going to design a screen for the operator, and specifically the operator's tasks. That narrows the scope of what you're doing. It will inevitably simplify the screens. In some cases, yes, you may end up designing an additional screen to maybe cater to, let's say, the maintainer or the administrator. But the reality is, oftentimes, too much data on the screen slows the users down, and it costs more than actually just maintaining and developing that initial separate screen. So from there, for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to assume that we've focused on the operator, the person doing an explicit task. And one of the things I like to talk about is perception. So I won't ask anyone on a conference call. I sometimes do this in a room, but most people, when they see this image, they might see a duck. But if you turn this image sideways, how many people now see a rabbit?
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about your perspective, all about where you're standing. It's not that either one of those scenarios is wrong. It's that you interpret it by the way you are set in perspective to it. So one of the things, for instance, you have to consider is understanding the user's environment. So for instance, this is a lift from a typical high performance HMI screen. This is more GE style internally of doing these things. And you're looking at different cues and visual cues. For instance, you'll notice that the gauges that represent pressure kind of curve in, so it gives a visual kind of indicator that that's a certain kind of gauge. A straight up and down fill gauge is rectangular. The one that has the bulb at the bottom is the thermometer. You have other ones that are as I said, flow, etc. But what happens when you're, for instance, in different scenarios? So, you want to reduce anything that distracts from the real job. Let's be honest, you're trying to process water, you're not trying to learn a software program. So the reality is you want to make sure, no pun intended, you want to make sure you go with flow, so to speak. You want those screens so that when the operator's looking at those screens, it's integrated into their day. I mean, I would spell success if we tried to take away the screens from the operators. They go, I can't live without those. That's what we're looking for in UX, that it actually helps me do my job. In a monitoring situation, usually it's about 6 screens that are in a control center, maybe more, but usually efficiently, if you narrowed it down, it's to 6. If there's an event, 4 of those screens will highlight. So you have to understand how you can bring focus to the 4 screens that have an issue or have prominence. You want to make sure you understand if there's distractions, noise level, is there eye strain? Are they interacting with touch or a mouse and a keyboard? That can make a lot of difference in the specificity or how tight the screen can be designed with clickable regions. But I'll go back to eye strain. This kind of visual, this bright kind of visual, works very well on a factory floor setting, where you do have tendency to bright lights, or if you're in a truck or something like that. And again, you have the laptop scenario bolted down to the dashboard. But in a control center, in a monitoring environment, you might take the identical screen and just dim all the colors and give them dark mode, because that's easier on the eyes in a low light environment. So there may be manufacturing environments that are low light environments too, and this would be better than, the factory floor that maybe is making appliances that is brightly lit. Maybe you're more in a manufacturing environment where you're making computer chips and lasers are running and you want the lights dimmer in that environment. So I'll go from there, and I'll first say this before I go to the slide. If Jimmy told me, you're running over, Joe, you only have one slide you can talk to these folks about, it would be this slide, to be honest. And it really is the second step. The first step is picking the persona, by the way. So the first step is picking that you're looking at operators, and then the second step is, and this is the most important part of doing high performance HMI. It is focusing on what the users need to see, and quite frankly, get all your folks into a room that are going to be making decisions how the HMIs are, and start doing the 5 whys process. And what that is essentially this. You go, why is displaying the KPI important? So this is a typical scenario. The graphic I'm showing you is an older HMI. You can see it. It's got the shaded tank, and it's definitely not a high performance graphic. And it's showing the fill level. And through the color, it's showing that there's a critical condition and the low level is marked. And you've also got the amount of liters of fluid that's there. And you've got the unique identifier of which tank it is as the label above it. And it goes, the operator needs to ensure that things are working properly. So, that's at a very prima facie level. So then the next question you ask is, why is this value significant? What does the operator, what does it let the operator know? So the answer might be, well, why is it significant? Because it allows them to see the fluid level of the tank so they don't run out mid-production of whatever fluid they're using. Okay. So you can see a scenario here where if the fluid's lower, I've actually changed it more to a high performance HMI graphic where I actually have an alert symbol next to it in case you have someone who's colorblind. For instance, the first scenario I showed you wouldn't work for someone like that because they might not be able to see the difference between the blue and the red. Or they just might look like 2 different shades of gray to them. You can see that the numbers are more aligned to each other in terms of how to scan left to right, looking at 68 and 19, and that it's on a leader setting. That's all in the same place. Everything is aligned. The name of the actual object that's on the screen is more prominent and again scannable and aligned. And you'll also see that the pipes are highlighted of which pipes are active, which pipes are shut off, which are intake, etc. Are all labeled and organized in a way that can be easily aligned. And again, this is all about scannability. But then you ask the next question, why is showing the actual numeric value to the operator necessary? You might be surprised to know, maybe it's not. Maybe it's that, they don't actually have to know what level the fluid's at. They just need to know there's about 20% left, because they want to make sure that they know when it needs to be refilled, but they don't really care about it up and coming. They just care when it gets to that 20% because they still have time. And then it's, why is 20% significant? Well, we find out from that this gives them enough time to switch the tanks and indicate to the maintenance that the tank needs to be refilled. So in other words, they're not the one to refill it. So we've reduced the graphic now to a little icon, the name, and whether it's filled to the right level and okay to use or not. And then the task becomes, if I click on the tank, I can switch the tank, and then I have to send a message to maintenance to go tell them they need to refill that other tank I switched from. So then the last question is, why is the operator required to tell maintenance? Couldn't switching the process automatically tell them? So in other words, it becomes one click now. So when I click on that, 2 things happen. The tanks get switched, and it sends the message to maintenance that the tank should be refilled. This full scenario is actually high performance HMI. And a lot of people usually stop at line 2. They make it look better, but they don't actually make it work better. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with this scenario, this one, but this would actually be the interface that the maintenance person would get so they can see how full the tank is, because they are responsible for filling the tank. But the operator doesn't need that clutter on their screen. They only need to know, is it good to go or is it not? And when I click this action, it's going to do two things and I don't have to worry about it. So it greatly reduces the process. So what I like to warn people of is when they say, hey, I want to do high performance HMI, it's not just the redesign of the screen. It's actually a redesign of the process. It is business process management change. If you do it right, you will change your workflow. So just wanted to point out some obvious things. When I say that things are made for different audiences, for instance, plant manager may be mostly interested in an overview screen, so it can lean in that direction in terms of information. Operators really exist in the middle ground. They have primary control over things and they can delve deep into a subsystem. But when it gets to the diagnostic part, that's really maintenance. Operators don't usually go to that level. So it's not like you have to create a duplicate screen for everything. I mean, this isn't an array. You can go from the overview all the way down to diagnostics. But understanding that when you design the different screens, say, okay, this is primarily going to be for the plant manager or the operator or maintenance in this case. So you have the level, and I'm sure most people are familiar with this, level 1, 2, 3, 4 screens, etc. But it's something that principally still holds true now with high performance HMI. Just want to show you quickly some examples of just how you need to think about the design attributes. So for instance, these are two distinct layouts. One's of a like literally a circuit breaker box board for a large power company. The other one is actually a train car and how loaded it is. So one of the things that's interesting is the scan space. So people scan in either an F pattern. So they're scanning it kind of like you would scan an Excel spreadsheet. They kind of go across the top of the columns, then they go to the next level, and they go to the next level and continue that down. Or they do a Z pattern. And the Z pattern is more for things that have status across the top, and then more of a, I would say, an architectural plan kind of diagram. This is actually the top view of a train car. And it shows you various different information in different spots. And then they scan across the bottom to see any specific details. More detailed level information is usually at the bottom. So there's these two patterns to consider. Another thing to consider is just font usage. There's a lot of fonts that are out there and people sometimes go a little wild with it. And I like, using different styles like most people, but the reality is serif typefaces aren't great to use because they have a lot of extra detail in them, and at small sizes they render in a weird way. If you use special fonts that like have drop caps and things like that, like this 5, it can throw off your data entry or your fields. If you see wide fonts, you don't want wide fonts because you have serial numbers and things like that may be 28 characters long, and that field will have to be that long. Condensed typefaces, look how close the S and the 5 are, in terms of just trying to read it, or even the decorative one where if you only look at half of like the 8, it could look like a 3. So you have to be careful of that representation. So it's all these different things that, they could be anywhere from overly complex to easily misinterpreted. And then, what you do want to select, and we actually use this in our software, we use Roboto, which is from Google. It's an open source typeface, but it essentially is designed specifically for computer software. So I'll give you the best example just to be brief here. But for instance, you'll notice on the monospace version, there's a slash through the O to definitely indicate that that's a 0, not a capital O. So this is very helpful when you are doing things like serial numbers or locations and people aren't sure really what kind of character it is. It has different weights so that you can do things, and we did this in the previous HMI screen. You make the value bolder because that's most important, and then you make your measurement, lighter in typeface so that, once people know you're in leaders, they know that probably the whole screen is in leaders. Therefore, this may become less important. They only want to scan the bolder thing. Another thing that I just like to show, and this is just a very high level, but it's a design example, is that, alignment is really, really important when you're doing design. So when you're laying out your high performance HMI and you're doing your different components, laying them out not necessarily how they exist in the real world and mimicking exactly what's in the real world, organizing them in a scannable fashion can be more useful to the end user than actually what it might look like, in front of them. So for instance, changing things like the size of the dots or the size of the components in it will actually build hierarchy. So obviously the larger dot is the most, important, and the smaller dots are the least important. And it feels like you're diving down information, and this has nothing, this has no type in it or anything. There's no reason for anyone to interpret that except with size. You might place something out of place intentionally to draw attention to it. Or you might make a different shape, or you might make a different color or contrast. All of these things are minor changes to this, but that dot is now the most prominent dot with the line around it because we just flipped its orientation in terms of color. So where does this exist in real practice? This is a small excerpt from an HMI. We've got a valve, we've got a pump, and we've got a motor. Let's say that they are balanced visual weight at this point. They're all as important to each other. No one of these is any more important than the other. But let's say I'm the operator. I'm the person that's in charge of motors. I care about what the pump's doing. I care about what the valve's doing, but I really care about what the motor's doing, because that's my job to make sure that's running optimally. So you might lay out like this instead, and give myself a little more information and a little more visual information with the actual gauge running, because the RPM is really important to me, because that's what I'm trying to monitor. I do need to know that the pump is running and that the valve's open and things like that, but it's not my primary responsibility. So layout's very important, and sizing. The other thing is color. So I'm sure you've heard this, but between 30 and 40% of people that work in factory environments and or technical environments that are doing maintenance, they have a certain level of color blindness. It's particularly high in males. It's very actually rare to have a woman who has color blindness, to be honest. It's extremely rare. But for instance, I ask, my designers to actually design their screens in grayscale first. That making sure that all the prominence in their designs is just, very seeable and very apparent without the use of color. Then when they're done with that, I have them go to full color. And obviously this enhances and helps the user experience, but it does allow them to know that their designs will work for that audience that may have those visual issues. And then the last thing I just wanted to cover is the animation, and this is always a tricky one. You really want to be careful of how you use animation, because it's extremely powerful. So for instance, for the generator example, I'm going to physically click on, this start button. And when I hit the start button, what's going to happen is it's going to flash and then it's going to spin. And that's telling me that the generator is starting up. And then when it's started up, then it tells me the power's on and it shows that the lines are active. That is a useful animation. Having an animation showing a spinning fan, if that has no relevance to what the operator needs to know, they just need to know the fan's on or off, it's better to use an on and off indicator than actually having an animation, because that's distracting visually from the data they may really need to see. So that's a startup animation. The compressor animation is another one, and this will show multi-states. So for instance, if this is a live gauge and it's going up and down with the numbers within the permissible area, and then it goes over the permissible area, it shows me that I'm in at some level of alarm. And then as it goes further, to be compliant with some standards, it actually is 18.2 standards. It's actually flashing now and showing the alarm. So it's containing all kinds of information through the animation. It's showing me that where I'm in range, where I'm out of range, when I creep into a different state and changes color and the symbol as I go into a more critical state. And so using animation that way is the best way because it's actually valuable information that helps the operator, offset an issue like this and maybe prevent it from getting to that red state. Obviously, this was very abbreviated and quick, escalation, but wanted to show you that. And so the thing that I'd wrap up with is that just think about it. Go back to that first slide where we talk about making it human. You want to make sure you're telling a story to the operator. You want to make sure that the screens that you're creating for them resonate with them in terms of their task and what they've been asked to do. Review high performance approach, the high performance book that's out, the high performance, making high performance HMI. It's a great book. It is not a complete book. The thing that it doesn't really do is talk about process change. It talks about the graphics a lot, which I think is all relevant. But the part that they do not talk about is the fact that you're really trying to streamline your process. Select that single target persona, outline a progressive hierarchy of the screens you're going to do, explain new screens and workflow, showcase specific benefits, and that's to your users. Bring users bring the actual operators into that design process. Walk through the scenarios, and then you want to identify all specialized, graphical elements, anything that's special. To be honest with you, that most HMIs really use very, very similar methods of indicators and really can be out of the box in many cases. It's when you do change something, make sure it's worth the change. And obviously, understand the organic nature of high performance. One of the advantages of a tool like Ops Hub is it's easy to update. And so, as you see users maybe having difficulty, maybe you make a tweak to your screen, as you find there's issues, and it will streamline and make your manufacturing more efficient. So just to show you very quickly, just some of the quick conversion outlines. This was actually a gas turbine interface that was done years ago. Applying these principles to it changed it from this to this. Now, it's not necessarily less complex. It doesn't have less things in the screen, but it is a lot more scannable and a lot more organized because of the principles that we were talking about, like alignment and scale. This one's a beautiful screen. It has a lot of information on it. It went from this to this. And then this was a plant startup screen. It went from these 4 screens to this one screen. And then this is actually in our demo software, I believe for iFIX. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jimmy. But this was done, and this was using the high performance handbook rules. And even doing this, the difference between that and applying what we talked about process, we went from this to this. And then lastly, best for last, a water example. So we did some experimentation a while ago and went, wow, some of these water screens are really complex. How could we simplify them? And we looked at ideas of like placing Google Maps in the background, doing different overlays, things like that. How could we make the controls a little more like panels and come in and out? We went from this to this. So that's what I have for you today. I'm happy, as Jimmy said, to take any questions either during the questions section or now. And I really, really appreciate your time.
Okay, so I guess moving on, what we want to do is kind of open up the microphones as well now as well. We do have our iFIX development manager on the call and some other technical folks. So if you guys do have any questions that you'd like to raise just in terms of, how do I do this? Or I do have one topic I wanted to bring up as well if no one else has anything. But if you do have anything, please go ahead.
And while we wait for folks to come off mute, encouraging everyone to, come into iFIX 2024 if you're using iFIX software to do your management and SCADA applications.
or even if you've had some experience with it. And I don't know if John, I don't know if you're on the call still, but I know you went through some of that recently. It'd be great if you want to kind of talk a little bit about that upgrade to 2024 and how it's gone.
So far with 2024 and using the iFIX thick client, not Ops Hub, the performance is exceptionally better. We went from 5.9 to 2024. And it is a huge improvement. As far as just workspace starting, it's a fraction of the time it was with 5.9. So we were really pleased to see that. I did have kind of a question for Joe on your high performance. You know, it's kind of a heavy lift. You know, when you look at, I looked at some of your displays and I've seen some of that in my previous life with the gas turbines and the steam turbines and stuff, and how busy we had our screens. Here in the water distribution, part of the struggle is that you have new operators, and they need some type of physical lay of the land. And so you're trying to draw it, and what I ran into is my biggest request I get is they want to see something that is almost physically similar to the layout of the equipment that's out in the field. And so that's a deviation from what you're showing. And so it's like I'm trying to balance that.
Yeah, and I think that's totally fair. I'm not big into throwing the baby out with the bathwater. In terms of its I don't think that to be high performance HMI compliant, you necessarily have to get totally away from the physical world. It's all about context. So in other words, water management is different because it does deal with physical, like what I showed. If you noticed, it did rely on the map being in the background, because you can't ignore the fact that, basically nature is your rain is your manufacturing system.
Right.
You're moving it. So, for instance, the idea with that is you could do a weather overlay on top of that map and see where it's going to rain and things like that. I just didn't go into an extended, presentation on that. But I think that, yes, I think that it's okay to duplicate or mimic in reality. It's just not necessarily in all cases. So I would say this, like, if someone wanted to understand how something works, then a diagrammatic representation of it totally can make sense. But but sometimes as you get to more advanced users, it's like, I just need to see a number. I don't need to see the little animated line and things like that, because that tends to be a mistake long term. But as I said, in terms of where a dam would be or a recycling plant would be and where the water flow goes and all of those things, that probably should be represented, in real format, in real life format, and show it on a map, because it just makes sense to. I was thinking more of when I said that, when I was looking at the circuit, for instance, version where it's, it's literally a numbered power box, and those switches actually could be distributed all over a plant, and you're just putting them in one place so that the person that's in charge and checking that those circuits are on and off can see them all at once.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Anytime.
John, I think Priya had a question for you. Were you able to identify any problems with your process since you exposed your data to the cloud?
Say that one more time.
Yeah. Were you able to identify any problems with your process since you exposed your data in the cloud?
Not really with our process, no. The bigger kick is basically building problems of the process would be basically getting all the tags built, getting the format you want, and then importing them into the historian, and just using Excel, but to import them in there so that your collector was the IoT collector, and getting that imported and making sure that you had that right, and you kind of had everything done right. And so it took me 2 or 3 iterations to get it correct. And then really no. Getting your string right and your JSON string as far as your connectivity, you do have to do a lot of registry work in there where you might have to go into the registry and actually tweak it and getting the security right. But it is fairly well defined in the ebooks. It's it's like any help file. You got to think like the developer because he's typing it that he or she understands it, but doesn't really get the message across for the end user. So you have to kind of really read between the lines. But as far as that goes, that would, I'd say the hardest struggle I had was the connection string and getting the iFIX tags the way I wanted them to look in the historian. And but as far as maintenance upkeep, it's been pretty maintenance free. I really don't touch it.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. And thank you, Priya, for asking.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have... Oh, sorry, go on.
I see another one. When you upgrade from 5.9 to 2024, did you import your old screens or create new ones? We imported. We kept our old ones. We didn't have any issues with that. We have, I guess you could say, a hybrid of the high performance or a low bred. We've taken away all the colors, so we're grayscale, and so we don't fight the red-green war anymore. That was just slow to be accepted by operations, but then they understood the common sense behind it. But we've kept all of them, so we have a lot of scripting behind that, and that's like so many end users, that's pretty hard to walk away from on a knee jerk, because it's years of development. We've had it for a long time, and that's another, like I say, it's a heavy lift going to Ops Hub.
Yeah, maybe on the Ops Hub stuff, we'll have to have a run with you on that, John. See how we might be able to help convert some of that. But any other questions, I guess, or comments? We do want to kind of keep this open if in terms of conversation as well. Like I said, we do have our technical team on in case there's some technical questions. But yeah, feel free to use chat or raise your hand and speak as well. All right. So one of the things, maybe, and we'll keep the questions or the lines open, so to speak, for questions. But I did want to just sort of do a little bit of a, reach out on getting some feedback as well. The intent here again is to really try to see how we can make this something that is beneficial, learn from each other, that's why I really wanted to bring a lot of our customers together to do this. So, I will be looking for topics for our next event. So we are going to have this quarterly. We are going to look at some potential topics like leveraging analytics and, those type of things in future events as well. Also, even things like, how to approach a master plan, that type of stuff. So if you guys have any kind of thoughts on what you'd like to see, definitely reach out to us as well. We'd love to get you, if you want to even present something, if you say, hey, you know what, I've got a great solution that's working for me that solves something and I want to share it with the community, we're definitely interested in that as well. So, definitely reach out to myself or Tanner on any kind of feedback, on this event. I know it was our first one. We had a few learning curves and some glitches, but, really, we want to improve it and make it more valuable for you guys as well as we continue to move forward with this. So any thoughts and ideas on that are appreciated as well. And the other thing actually I did have on the agenda is if you also have some specific product requests or solution requests, problems you'd like to see us solve with our software. Again, you can either chat, speak out, or send us a message on that as well. As always, we're always looking for new ideas and ways we can improve our software as well.
Absolutely. Hey, sorry about that. I was trying to get off mute. I think I was double muted. Just wanted to kind of piggyback off that and just thank everyone for their time. I know, definitely a time commitment to join us today. I hope everyone got great value out of it and enjoyed the first session. And we are very excited to see what kind of feedback we get, so we can make sure that the following sessions are not just top notch, but also speak to the specific topics that may be of interest.
All right. Well, I guess we can end here, Tanner. And again, thank everyone for joining, and look forward to our next event. Thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video insightful, click here to watch the next video and learn how GE Vernova is at the forefront of tackling challenges in the water and wastewater industry.